I wanted to take just a few minutes to talk to you about Tim O'Brien's The Things They Carried. Um, this video might feel a little different than some of the others where we've talked about the literature because the points are a little bit out of order and it may be hard to kind of follow along with the text. But at the very least, just listen closely, and when I can, I will point out specific things in the text. So when we think about the story, we first have to consider what the story is about. What's the purpose of the story? And I don't mean, when I say purpose, I don't mean like, is it to entertain or to teach or to what, to inform or something like that. It's not quite what I mean. What I'm saying is, what do we take away from the story? Why is it a story that is being told? Um, and there's a variety of things we could come up with in this regard, but mostly it's showcasing to us both the horrors of being at war, and it's also presenting an interesting commentary on how we how we react when we are facing really hard stuff. And I bring that up because I think it's important that we really look at the language in this first paragraph. And the language is carried throughout the story, but it's very much in this first paragraph that we're being set up with understanding how these men, and I want to make clear, in most cases, young men, very young men, are dealing with being at war. So we get First Lieutenant Jimmy Cross carried letters from a girl named Martha, a junior at Mount Sebastian College in New Jersey. They were not love letters, but Lieutenant Cross was hoping. So I read the first sentence because it really kind of gives us the setup here, right? We understand that Jimmy Cross is going to be our focus and that Martha is something he's preoccupied with. But even more so than that, as we go through this first paragraph, the language that's being used, I want to draw your attention to the word hoping. Then a little bit later, we get the word pretending. And a bit after that, we get the word imagine. If we go down a little bit further, we get pretended. And then oh my, I apologize. My watch is talking to me. Then we get a bit distracted and then wonder. And I'm pointing all of these out to you because they suggest that our main character in this story, Jimmy Cross, he's physically in one place and he is mentally in another. He's dissociating. And he's using these letters for Martha as a coping mechanism. And we understand that this is one of the realities of war. And as a reader, you might say, well, I've never been to war. How do I relate to this? But you might have had a struggle in your life that you needed some way to escape from, that you needed some way to cope. And for Lieutenant Jimmy Cross, who has the weight of the world on him, he is choosing to cope through this fantasy related to Martha. We'll also talk about, as we go on in this video, about the other men in the platoon and how they're dealing with being at war as well. But I think it's important that we kind of dive into this idea of Jimmy and Martha. We're told right from the beginning that the letters that he's reading were not exactly love letters, but Jimmy Cross was hoping that it could be something more. It's important that we understand that what we are presented with from Jimmy is an infatuation. It is a fantasy, but it's not actual love. At times, there's places where, some of the things he's talking about or thinking about feel a little bit creepy, especially when he's, fantasizing about maybe tying her up. He should have done that when they went out on their one date. But more than anything, we're to come to understand that he is using these letters from Martha as his escape, as his way of coping with all of the horror that's around him. All right, the next thing we need to talk about is weight. And we are getting a number of ways that weight is being presented to us. This term, we've had several stories that have provided us with lists as a way of presenting information. And in each story, it's used slightly differently. So when we read Girl, that list of all those directives was meant to help us understand how the girl, who's now an adult, has internalized all of the teachings and directives from her mother. When we read 10 Things, we understand that the widow in that story, she is using the list to make sense of all of the grief and guilt she is feeling. In Muddling, we have Finley K, and we get all of those rambling lists of all the things he's seeing, and it makes us confused, and we understand that that's helping us feel that same sort of confusion that Finley's feeling, because we're almost taking in so much information we can't process it all. In this story, the long list of items, sometimes tangible, sometimes not, are meant to help us understand the burden that these young men have as they are off to war. And so we're told about the different things they're carrying. So we get P38 can openers, pocket knives, heat tabs, wristwatch, dog tags, mosquito repellent, chewing gum, candy, cigarettes, salt tablets, packets of Kool-Aid, lighters, matches, sewing kits, military. And then lots of times those lists are followed by together these items weighed, and then we get whatever that weight is. And the way these lists are functioning in this story is to help us understand the weight that the character is feeling, but also as we're reading these lists, sometimes it's even things we don't actually know what are. Like we might have an idea that they're talking about a certain type of ammo or a certain type of gun or whatever the case may be. It's to overwhelm us and make us feel that burden as well as a reader. Like it's just so much that it's exhausting. And that's to help us as readers kind of understand what our characters are feeling. There's also importance to what each character might be carrying. So we'll talk through that in just a moment. About what each man is carrying and what that reveals to us about his character. I think it's important that we also understand the intangible weight that the men are carrying. And if we go over to page 8, and there's plenty of examples of this, but I think the paragraph on the page that begins, let me look for it. It's really not so much, it's kind of mid-paragraph as opposed to the beginning of a paragraph. It says this: they carried their own lives. The pressures were enormous. In the heat of early afternoon, they would remove their helmets and flak jackets, walking bare, which was dangerous, but which helped ease the strain. They would often discard things along the route of the march, purely for comfort. They would throw away rations, blow their claymore and grenades, no matter, because by nightfall, the resupply chopper would arrive with more of the same. Then a day or two later, still more, fresh watermelons and crates of ammunition and sunglasses and woolen sweaters. The resources were stunning. Sparklers for the 4th of July, colored eggs for Easter. It was the great American war chest, the fruits of science, the smokestacks, the canneries, the arsenals at Hartford, the Minnesota forests, the machine shops, the vast fields of corn and wheat. They carried like freight trains. They carried it on their backs and shoulders. And for all the ambiguities of Vietnam, all the mysteries unknown and unknowns, there was at least the single abiding certainty that they would never be at a loss for things to carry. This is a really nice glimpse into the intangibles that they're carrying, because it provides us this really interesting imagery. And it talks about this as the great American war chest, all the things that would be dropped off to them for supplies. But it goes from these are the things that they're giving to us to really pulling up this imagery of America. It says the fruits of science, the smokestacks, the canneries, the arsenals at Hartford, the Minnesota forests, the machine shops, the vast fields of corn and wheat. These are all things in America, and they're saying they feel like they are carrying the weight of the country on their backs. They have the pressure of their whole worlds on them. And I think it's important to understand just how heavy a weight that would be to carry. And part of understanding that is understanding the Vietnam War. This was a war where the draft was used. Many of the men who went to war did volunteer, but many were also young men who were drafted. Their number was called, and they had the choice of finding a way to get out of it and dodge the draft, whether that was through running away or being in school or having a medical condition, or they simply had to go fight a war that they didn't have any interest in fighting. And we're seeing a lot of that through what these young men are carrying and some of the things that are said. they're not prepared to be at war. And in many cases, they didn't choose to be at war. So I think it's important that we understand that. I also think the story opens up an interesting conversation on who we ask to fight wars for us. And it makes sense in a lot of ways, right? You take young men and put them at war because they're physically fit and capable, but psychologically, your brain is not developed until you're like 25, 26 years old. So the idea that we're taking 18-year-olds or 20-year-olds or 21-year-olds, and Jimmy Cross is leading, but he's not that much older than them. He too is still a young man. Keep in mind that Martha, who he's fantasizing about, is in college. So we're talking he might be 20, 21, 22. These are all kids in a lot of respect. And, you think about if you are a typical freshman, 18, 19 years old, or even, maybe a little younger, maybe a little older, think about the idea of having to go to war. That's a tremendous burden, especially if it's something that you're not at all interested in. Take that into account that then also your brain's not really fully developed just yet. And it's kind of it's really no wonder that the soldiers who went off to Vietnam came back really, really struggling with PTSD and what they saw at war. Vietnam was a different kind of war than what we had fought before. And it was a really deadly war, and it was a war that was hotly debated. So it wasn't even like there were certainly people in the States who, cheered on our soldiers and all the rest of it, but there were also people in the United States who were protesting the war and protesting our soldiers and protesting what was happening, because this was kind of the first war that the American people had, not quite a live feed, but had got visuals of what was happening at war, because we suddenly had the technology of that. We had the nightly news, we had TV, and this was a first for the country. So the public opinion on this war really shifted, because we were hearing about a lot of the things that were happening that were not only just brutal because it was war, but also pretty unethical. It was not uncommon for American soldiers to, like we see in this story, set fire to a whole community, or for our soldiers to go into communities and rape the women. And that was a thing that did happen. And the American people were aware of some of those things that were happening. So it was a case of our boys that were over there fighting were fighting a war that was using war tactics that we really hadn't seen before by way of our soldiers. There was a lot of guerrilla warfare going on, and our soldiers were doing things that, maybe weren't the best, but they were, and not to excuse things that happen, but again, these were kids that were thrown kind of to the wilderness and told, go fight this war. And so it's really complicated, is the point I'm making. And I want us to understand that so that we can start to understand our characters. Start to think about each of the men and their characters. We're revealed things through those lists of things people are carrying, and sometimes it reveals their more specialized roles in the platoon, and sometimes it's meant to provide to us information about the characters. And it really kind of, I think, in a lot of ways, helps us to understand the kind of the different characters and what is kind of making them who they are. So we have, we'll kind of just, I'll run through a short list of who our characters are and what those items that they're carrying around reveals about them. So with Jimmy, he's carrying around that pebble from Martha, as well as the letters from Martha. And then he obviously has other things that are related to the war that he's carrying around, but those are kind of the two things I want to highlight. Norman Bowker is carrying around a diary and a thumb. The thumb's kind of interesting because it's not uncommon historically for people who have been at war to take kind of like trophies of people who've been killed as kind of a superstition maybe, or as a point of pride perhaps, or a point of not wanting to forget the atrocities of what they're seeing. Lee Strunk carries a slingshot. Kiowa carries a New Testament, a pair of moccasins, a hatchet, and his grandmother's distrust of the white man. Rat Kiley carries comic books, M&Ms, brandy. Henry Dobbins carries his girlfriend's pantyhose, and we're told he really enjoys extra rations, particularly that are sweet and syrupy. Mitchell Sanders carries condoms, brass knuckles, and fancy fatigues. Ted Lavender, we're told, carries tranquilizers and dope. Dave Jensen has extra socks and dental floss and soap and vitamins and earplugs. He also carries a rabbit's foot, which is a superstition. So when we think about these different men, lots of what they're carrying helps us better understand them. We understand that Kiowa, he is carrying the conflict that comes with being a Native American and fighting for the United States. He also carries a Bible with him. So it really does show that conflict of, he has a Bible, which is a symbol of Christianity and of, in many ways, of America and the role Christianity has played within American society. And then also his grandmother's distrust of white men. We see with Rat Kiley, he has those comic books, and even though he's kind of the medic and he helps ease people in, he's carrying M&Ms with him. These are very childlike things. Lee Strunk's slingshot, also childlike. Having Mitchell Sanders with the condoms. Lots of times, I mentioned the potential of rape, but lots of times the men were going in and having sex with women who Vietnamese women. So that was there. Henry Dobbins has his girlfriend's pantyhose. That's his escape from the war, the way he is coping. Ted Lavender, with this idea of coping, is really prevalent with his marijuana. And then Dave Jensen has all of these protective things that, might keep him extra healthy, extra safe. So these are indications of how each of the different men are trying to cope, whether it's through religion or through superstition or through a fantasy or through self-medication. They're each trying to do something to help them feel okay with what is happening. And understanding that is so very important to understanding who these men are and what is happening and what they're facing. What's happening in this story that is really impacting these characters is the death of Ted Lavender. We see that Jimmy Cross is really affected by it, but all of the men are. They burn up the town or the village nearby because of this murder of Ted Lavender. There's also a tremendous amount of guilt that comes with Ted Lavender's death. He dies in a way that is difficult for the men to process. It's the first death they've had among their platoon. That, at least that's the way it's presented to us. So we have to believe that that is in fact the case. So it's worth taking the time to kind of have a look at how this death is presented and how it affects the men. So the story, we are presented with the day of April 16th, and this is what it says. On April 16th, when Lee Strunk drew the number 17, he laughed and muttered something and went down quickly. The morning was hot and very still. Not good, Kiowa said. He looked at the tunnel opening, then out across the dry paddy toward the village of Tenkey. Nothing moved, no clouds or birds or people. As they waited, the men smoked and drank Kool-Aid, not talking much, feeling sympathy for Lee Strunk, but also feeling the luck of the draw. You win some, you lose some, said Mitchell Sanders, and sometimes you settle for a rain check. It was a tired line and no one laughed. Henry Dobbins ate a tropical chocolate bar. Ted Lavender popped a tranquilizer and went off to pee. After 5 minutes, Lieutenant Jimmy Cross moved to the tunnel, leaned down,
and examined the darkness. Trouble, he thought, a cave-in maybe. And then suddenly, without willing it, he was thinking about Martha, the stresses and fractures, the quick collapse, the two of them buried alive under all that weight. Dense, crushing love. Kneeling, watching the whole, he tried to concentrate on Lee Strunk and the war, all the dangers, but his love was too much for him. He felt paralyzed. He wanted to sleep inside her lungs and breathe her blood and be smothered. He wanted her to be a virgin and not a virgin all at once. He wanted to know her intimate secrets. Why poetry? Why so sad? Why the grayness in her eyes? Why so alone? Not lonely, just alone. Riding her bike across campus or sitting off by herself in the cafeteria, even dancing. She danced alone, and it was the aloneness that filled him with love. He remembered telling her that one evening how she nodded and looked away, and how later, when he kissed her, she received the kiss without returning it, her eyes wide open, not afraid, not a virgin's eyes, just flat and uninvolved. Lieutenant Cross gazed at the tunnel, but he was not there. He was buried with Martha under the white sand at the Jersey shore. They were pressed together, and the pebble was in his mouth and her tongue. He was smiling vaguely. He was aware and how quiet the day was, the sullen patties, yet he could not bring himself to worry about matters of security. He was beyond that. He was just a kid at war and love. He was 24 years old. 24. I said 22 earlier, but 24. He couldn't help it. A few months later, Lee Strunk crawled out of the tunnel. He came up grinning, filthy and alive. Lieutenant Cross nodded and closed his eyes while others clapped Strunk on the back and made jokes about rising from the dead. Worms, right, Rat Kiley said. Right out of the grave. Fucking zombie. The men laughed. They all felt relief. Spook City, said Mitchell Sanders. Lee Strunk made a funny ghost sound, a kind of moaning, yet very happy. And right then, when Strunk made that high, happy moaning sound and went, oh, right then, Ted Lavender was shot in the head on his way back from peeing. He lay with his mouth open. The teeth were broken. There was a swollen black bruise under his left eye. The cheekbone was gone. Oh, shit, right, Rat Kiley said. The guy's dead. The guy's dead, he kept saying, which seemed profound. The guy's dead. I mean, really. The things they carried were determined to some extent by superstition. Lieutenant Cross carried his good luck pebble. Dave Jensen carried a rabbit foot. Norman Bowker, otherwise a very gentle person, carried a thumb that had been presented to him as a gift by Mitchell Sanders. So we'll pause here. I think it's interesting, a couple of things. First, we get the scene where Ted Lavender is in fact killed, and then that's followed by this idea of superstition and how they're trying to keep themselves safe through being superstitious, but clearly that has not worked here. So this, we understand, or we come to understand, that Jimmy Cross takes on the burden and the guilt of one of his men dying, and that's going to create this change in him, which we'll talk about in just a bit. But I think it's important that we understand the dynamic that's taking place in the story and kind of where the people are, because Jimmy Cross blames himself for Ted dying. But if we understand what we're being told, Lee Strunk is down in this, he's down in this tunnel. He's checking to see if there's a bomb. Like he drew the short straw. He had to go do this thing. So he's down in it. Ted is crouched down, looking down into the tunnel. And while that's happening, Ted Lavender has wandered off to pee. You can make a case that someone should have gone with him, that had stricter protocols been at play. That would not have happened. And perhaps that is, in fact, a failure of leadership. As a person who comes from a military family, my father was a Marine. There's certainly leadership, ownership of the fact that Ted Lavender was killed in this way that falls to Jimmy. But during that moment, even though Jimmy was fantasizing about Martha, he was actually doing what he was supposed to be, which was looking after his man who was down in the tunnel. And it's important that we understand that for the most part, they were doing what they were supposed to. Ted, who was needing to relieve himself, chose to walk off and do that alone. And again, it's not that there weren't things that maybe Jimmy could have done, but it's a maybe. We don't know that Ted Lavender's fate would have been any different had Jimmy been super strict. And I think that's an important point to make before we talk about the end of the story.
Before we get into discussing the ending of the story, there's another idea that we need to talk about, and it kind of goes in with this idea of weight. Um, but it really brings into the reality of war and how the men emotionally are feeling. And so this is what it says, and this is toward the bottom of page 10. For the most part, they carried themselves with poise, a kind of dignity. Now and then, however, there were times of panic when they squealed or wanted to squeal but couldn't, when they twitched and made moaning sounds and covered their heads and said, dear Jesus, and flopped around on the earth and fired their weapons blindly, and cringed and sobbed and begged for the noise to stop and went wild and made stupid promises to themselves and to God and to their mothers and fathers, hoping not to die. In different ways, it happened to all of them. Afterward, when the firing ended, they would blink and peek up. They would touch their bodies, feeling shame, then quickly hiding. They would force themselves to stand, and as if in slow motion, frame by frame, the world would take on old logic, absolute silence, then the wind, then sunlight, then voices. It was the burden of being alive. Awkwardly, the men would reassemble themselves and first in private, then in groups, becoming soldiers again. They would repair the leaks in their eyes. They would check for casualties, call in dust-offs, light cigarettes, try to smile, clear their throats and spit, and begin cleaning their weapons. After a time, someone would shake his head and say, no lie, I almost shit my pants. And someone else would laugh, which meant it was bad, yes, but the guy had obviously not shit his pants. It wasn't that bad. And in any case, nobody would ever do such a thing and then go ahead and talk about it. They would squint into the dense, oppressive sunlight. For a few moments, perhaps, they would fall silent, lighting a joint and tracking its passage from man to man, inhaling, holding in the humiliation. Scary stuff, one of them might say. But then someone else would grin or flick his eyebrow and say, Roger Dodger almost cut me a new asshole. Almost. There were numerous such poses. Some carried themselves with a sort of wistful resignation, others with pride or stiff soldierly discipline or good humor or macho zeal. They were afraid of dying, but they were even more afraid to show it. They found jokes to tell. They used hard vocabulary to contain this terrible softness. Greased, they'd say, oft, lit up, zip while zapping. It wasn't cruelty, just stage presence. They were actors. When someone died, it wasn't quite dying, because in a curious way it seemed scripted. And because they had their lines mostly memorized, irony mixed with tragedy, and because they called it by other names, as if to insist and destroy the reality of such death itself. They kicked corpses, they cut off thumbs, they talked grunt lingo, they told stories about Ted Lavender's supply of tranquilizers, how the poor guy didn't feel a thing, how incredibly tranquil he was. There's a moral here, said Mitchell Sanders. They were waiting for Lavender's choppers, smoking the dead man's dope. The moral's pretty obvious, Sanders said and winked. Stay away from drugs. No joke. They'll ruin your day every time. Cute, said Henry Dobbins. Mind blower, get it? Talk about Wiggy. Nothing left, just blood and brains. They made themselves laugh. There it is, they'd say, over and over. There it is, my friend. There it is. And if the repetition itself were an act of poise, a balance between crazy and almost crazy, knowing without going, there it is, which meant be cool, let it ride, because oh yeah, man, you can't change what can't be changed. There it is. There absolutely and positively and fucking well is. They were tough. They carried all the emotional baggage of men who might die. Grief, terror, love, longing. These were intangibles, but the intangibles had their own mass and specific gravity. They had tangible weight. They carried shameful memories. They carried the common secret of cowardice, barely restrained, the instinct to run or freeze or hide. And in many respects, this was the heaviest burden of all, for it could never be put down. It required perfect balance and perfect posture. They carried their reputations. They carried the soldier's greatest fear, which was the fear of blushing. Men killed and died because they were embarrassed not to. It was what had brought them to the war in the first place. Nothing positive, no dreams of glory or honor, just to avoid the blush of dishonor. They did so
as not to die of embarrassment. They crawled into tunnels and Walt Point and advanced under fire each morning. Despite the unknowns, they made their legs move. They endured. They kept humping. They did not submit to the obvious alternative, which was to simply close their eyes and fall. So easy, really. Go limp and tumble to the ground and let the muscle unwind and not speak and not budge until your buddies picked you up and lifted you into the chopper that would roar and dip its nose and carry you off to the world, a mere matter of falling. Yet no one ever fell. It was not courage exactly. The object was not valor. Rather, they were too frightened to be cowards. By and large, they carried these things inside, maintaining the mask of composure. So we get this really interesting piece here that, talks about how really what they're doing is avoiding the embarrassment of being afraid, of showing that they're afraid. And so they use harsh language and they um, talk badly about people who, take the easy way out, shooting off their own toes or fingers. But it's what they all desire to do because it's so terrible where they are. And then we get this really interesting paragraph. It says, at night on guard, staring into the dark, they were carried away by jumbo jets. They felt like the rush of takeoff. Gone, they yelled, and then the velocity, wings, and engines, a smiling stewardess, but it was more than a plane. It was a real bird, a big, sleek silver bird with feathers and talons and high screeching. They were flying. It's important to note that they believe they're on a real bird in this fantasy. With the description, we can assume it's probably um, a bird such as an eagle. Again, that American symbolism here. They laughed and held on tight, feeling the cold slap of wind and altitude soaring, thinking, it's over, I'm gone. They were naked, they were light and free. It was all lightness, bright and fast and buoyant, light and light. A helium buzz in the brain, a giddy bubbling in the lungs, as they were taken up and over the clouds in the war, beyond duty, beyond gravity and mortification and global entanglements. Senwa, they yelled. I'm sorry, motherfuckers, but I'm out of it. I'm goofed. I'm on a space cruise. I'm gone. And it was a restful, unencumbered sensation, just riding the light waves, sailing that big silver freedom bird over the mountains and oceans, over America, over the farms, in great sleeping cities and cemeteries and highways and the golden arches of McDonald's. It was flight, a kind of fleeing, a kind of falling higher and higher, spinning off the edge of the earth and beyond the sun and through the vast silent vacuum where there were no burdens, where everything weighed exactly nothing. Gone, they screamed. I'm sorry, but I'm gone. And so at night, not quite dreaming, they gave themselves over to the lightness. They were carried. They were purely born. So notice here that the fantasy is to be light, to have lightness. And not necessarily physical lightness, although I'm sure they aren't real excited about carrying all the weight that they're carrying, but that emotional lightness that would come from um, from not being at war and the likeness that you have before you ever were at war. So it's in many regards something they really can't ever get back. And that's one of these realities of war, one of these really, really harsh, awful realities. Um, and then we get to our closing scene, which I promised we'd get back to, which is, how Ted changes. So we see that he ultimately blames his fantasy about Martha, his obsession with Martha and, his quote unquote love for Martha. And he ultimately decides that he has to make a change because he doesn't want to feel this way before, that guilt and responsibility for losing a man. He says, no more fantasies, he told himself. Henceforth, when he talked about Martha, it would be only to think that she belonged elsewhere. He would shut down the daydreams. This was not Mount Sebastian. It was another world where there were no pretty poems or midterm exams, a place where men died because of carelessness and gross stupidity. Kai was right. Boom, down, and you were dead. Never partly dead. Briefly, in the rain, Lieutenant Martha Cross saw Martha's gray eyes gazing back at him. He understood. It was very sad, he thought. The things men carried inside, the things men did or felt they had to do. He almost nodded at her, but he didn't. Instead, he went back to his maps. He was now determined to perform his duties firmly and without negligence. It wouldn't help Lavender. He knew that. But from this point on, he could comport himself as an officer.
He would dispose of his good luck pebble, swallow it maybe, or use Lee Strunk's slingshot, or drop it along the trail. On the march, he would impose strict field discipline. He would be careful to send out flank security to prevent straggling or bunching up, or to keep his troops moving at a proper pace and at the proper interval. He would insist on clean weapons. He would confiscate the remainder of Lavender's dope. Later in the day, perhaps he would call the men together and speak to them plainly. He would accept the blame for what had happened to Ted Lavender. He would be a man about it. He would look them in the eyes, keeping his chin level, and he would issue the new SOPs in a calm, impersonal tone of voice, a lieutenant's voice, leaving no room for argument or discussion. Commencing immediately, he'd tell them they would no longer abandon equipment along the route of the march. They would police up their acts. They would get their shit together and keep it together and maintain it neatly and in good working order. He would not tolerate laxity. He would show strength, thence distancing himself. Among the men, there would be grumbling, of course, and maybe worse, because their days would seem longer, their loads heavier. But Lieutenant Jimmy Cross reminded himself that his obligation was not to be loved, but to lead. He would dispense with love. It was not now a factor, and if anyone quarreled or complained, he would simply tighten his lips and arrange his shoulders in the correct command posture. He might give a curt little nod, or he might not. He might just shrug and say, "Carry on," and then they would saddle up and form into a column and move out toward the villages of West Key. So this is a really interesting way to end the story, and it's kind of the most logical space for Jimmy Cross to go, choosing to take responsibility for Ted's death. He is the leader of the platoon. So again, even if he was doing what he needed to for his other man, he wasn't keeping them all safe, and he can see holes in his leadership that he believes led to this eventuality for Ted Lavender. That said, we're hit again with the reality of war. Yes, Jimmy Cross is probably making the right decision for being at war, to make sure he's running a tight ship, that he is doing everything he can to control the situation. It doesn't mean that other men won't die. In fact, they will. If you went on to read the rest of this book, you would learn that they would. But it's something that he can control, and there's kind of this coming of age. He's growing up in this moment. And yet something kind of sad's happening here too. He tells us in this last bit that he's going to dispense of love. His goal was not to be loved, but to lead. Love was now not a factor. And this is really important because it shows us this reality of war. He's ultimately sacrificing his humanity so that he can do right by his men. And that's exactly what he should do in many regards, many would argue. And in some ways, it's a form of love. And yet, when you choose to become emotionless, you're choosing to shut off kind of what makes you uniquely a person. And so there's a great loss that comes with this. And it's not just the loss of Ted Lavender, which is so incredibly tragic, but Jimmy ultimately is choosing to lose himself as a sacrifice for his men, to try to keep them safe. We talked about with another story, Honey Boy, about this Christ-like figure, and we see some of the same imagery used here with Jimmy, who's ultimately going to choose to do away with his emotions, his ability to love, in an effort, as an act of love, in an effort to save his men, to keep them alive. I hope you have gotten something out of this video that helps you better understand the story. If you have questions or need help with it, as always, please just let me know.